Hi, this is Dr. Culkin once again, here to discuss topic 9. After John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, Lyndon Johnson became president. Skilled at working with Congress, he helped secure the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, as well as overseeing the establishment of Medicare, which provided health insurance for those over 65, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which provided over $1 billion in federal aid to schools. While successful on the domestic front, Johnson also took the nation deeper into the conflict with Vietnam. Both Kennedy and Johnson embraced the policy of containment and saw the small country of Vietnam as critical to stopping the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. In 1961, Kennedy had authorized aids to the southern Vietnamese to fight off the northern communist regime led by Ho Chi Minh. Johnson continued the policy of aid to southern Vietnam and expanded support for covert operations. In August 1964, there was a confrontation between American destroyers gathering intelligence in the Gulf of Tonkin and northern Vietnamese gunboats. The next day, on August 5th, Johnson asked Congress to pass a resolution authorizing him to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, and Congress agreed. The resolution gave Johnson broad power. Usually the president has to go to Congress to declare war on a country. Here, Congress had given Johnson basically the power to do whatever he wanted without officially declaring war. The resolution, the U.S. began to bomb the North and would eventually send 500,000 troops to the country. Johnson's commitment to Vietnam began to influence his popularity on the home front, despite the popularity of the measures that he had passed domestically, as there was growing resistance to the war. Protests began in 1965, primarily in universities. And then discontent eventually expanded beyond students, and Johnson became increasingly unpopular, especially as it became clear after the Tet Offensive in 1968 that the U.S. was not, in fact, winning the war. Johnson decided not to run again for president, and the Republican Richard Nixon was elected in November, and this is partly because the Democratic Party was very split over what to do about the war. Nixon had a three-part approach towards Vietnam: gradual withdrawal of American troops, and as part of that training southern Vietnamese to act as combat troops, renewed bombing, and also hardline negotiations. A truce was finally signed in 1973. In return for the release of prisoners of war, the U.S. would withdraw its troops. Within 2 years, South Vietnam and communist North Vietnam would merge into a communist country. Nixon's biggest success in terms of foreign policy was achieving détente, or a relaxing of tensions, with the Soviet Union. He started by reaching out first to China, actually, in 1972, easing the hostility which had existed between those two countries since China had become a communist country in 1949. Because the USSR saw China as an adversary, a relationship between China and the U.S. was very threatening to the USSR, and thus they too reached out to the United States. Soon Nixon and the Soviet leader Brezhnev signed documents which limited the number of certain kinds of missiles both countries could have. But the détente only lasted until 1977. Tension was already growing between the Soviet Union and the U.S., which was now led by President Jimmy Carter, particularly over the issue of human rights, which was very important to Carter. The breaking point came when the USSR invaded Afghanistan, causing Carter to threaten to armed resistance to any further expansion by the USSR towards the Persian Gulf. And he also takes a variety of other measures, including pulling the United States out of the Olympics. American society changed a great deal over the 1960s and 70s. The civil rights movement's success with the Equal Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act far from marked the end of that movement, but it was a movement that changed dramatically as African Americans grew frustrated over the slow pace of development such as economic equality. Just because you have laws in place obviously doesn't mean that the society automatically changes or instantaneously changes, and those changes are still underway. But frustration led to sort of a change in the philosophy of many people within the movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, became an all-African American institution, and one that, despite its name, was no longer committed to the idea of nonviolent resistance. And this is also where you see the rise of Malcolm X as a civil rights leader who had a much more militant philosophy than Martin Luther King. At the same time, other groups, including Mexican Americans and Native Americans, were inspired by the successes of the civil rights movement to argue for their own rights and respect and recognition of their cultures as an important part of American society. The women's rights movement also emerged. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had listed sex as a protected category, and women began to argue for equal pay for equal work, as well as access to all professions. At the same time, feminists began to critique depictions of women in the media and social assumptions about women's capacities. The 1970s brought other changes as well. Watergate and the failure in Vietnam left the country distrustful of government and concerned about the U.S. position in the world. Oil and gas prices rose dramatically due to the United States' reactions to tensions in the Middle East, which led to an oil embargo. And there was also a decline in domestic oil production, which also led to increasing oil prices. These high oil prices, as well as federal budget deficits brought on by the Vietnam War, led to dramatic inflation. Foreign competition, as well as the failure of American companies to innovate, led to problems and a decline in U.S. industry, which had once dominated world markets. Rising prices in the women's movement led to an increasing number of women who wanted to work outside the home. At the same time, the divorce rate is also soaring. Americans lived in a very different world by the end of the 1970s than they had in the post-war boom of the 1950s. And next week, when we read about Reagan, we'll see the reaction to those changes. Okay, so that's it for this week. Make sure to participate in the discussion boards and answer the reading questions, and email me if you have any questions. Thanks.